Dear friends, dear online viewers, welcome to Martens Center Thinking Talks. I'm Tomi Huhtanen, Executive Director of Martens Center, and today we speak about the war in Ukraine, Europe, the future of Europe, and many other issues with our board member of Martens Center, Roberta Metsola, also, of course, President of the European Parliament. Madam Metsola, Madam President, welcome to Thinking Talks.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you for having me.
I remember the moment when you were elected. We were all with the masks, with different color of masks, very much reflecting after 2 years of pandemic, how to come out from that situation, how our economy will look like, and how the post-COVID world would be. Little did we know that only some weeks, months later, we were totally in the midst of much bigger crisis in Europe, and I would say that has very much defined the start of your mandate. Madam President, for the European Union, which is not essentially a defense union, military alliance, what does the war in Ukraine mean?
Well, you are right in saying that if somebody had told me on the day of my election almost 100 days ago that this would be dominating the first weeks of my presidency, I would not have believed you, because simply I would not have thought that we would have war in Europe, that we would have a country that is brutally attacked and invaded by another simply for defining and defending our values, our principles, what we believe in, whether we talk about rule of law, whether we talk about democracy, we talk about territorial integrity. But the reality is that Ukraine today is fighting Europe's war. And that has meant that after a very difficult 2 years of a pandemic, where, as you say, big challenges, but also unity in the European Union in addressing such a challenge, even where it did not have competence, I think also equipped us with the political will, the courage, and also the unprecedented will of institutions. One of them is the one which I lead, the European Parliament, to say, do you know what, this is unacceptable, and we are going to do everything to help Ukrainians who are fighting our fight. And if we fail to do that, then we would not only have failed Ukraine, we would have failed Europe. So that's why it was necessary to adopt unprecedented sanctions against Russia. We need to continue to work on that. We have committed military equipment. I decided to visit Kiev in order for me not only to send a message of solidarity, but to come back with the tangible demands of Ukraine looking to Europe, and Europe needing to respond to the demands of Ukraine.
You mentioned your trip to Kiev some time ago, and speaking about will, and I'm sure that in your time as the President of the Parliament, that's a trip which you will remember. For you, and also I have to say, you know, the security situation was much more serious than it is, for example, now. What was your main takeaway from that trip to Kiev?
It was a difficult decision, but it was necessary. It's one that I took with responsibility, keeping in mind, yes, the security question, but there was no doubt in my mind that I needed to go. So when I was invited by my counterpart, the President of the Ukrainian Parliament, to address an extraordinary session, I simply took the decision. I said, yes, I will be there Friday at 1 o'clock. Of course, how I was going to go there and what would happen between a little bit more than 48 hours between the decision and when I arrived, it was still unclear. But there are moments that you have to take that decision. And I took it with, let's say, full knowledge of the fact that the Ukrainians needed a tangible message of support that was not only given to them over the screens or on the telephone, but needed to be given like this. Across each other. When I arrived there, you find a city that was completely at the time deserted because it was still encircled. Multiple checkpoints, very, very eerie feeling, especially in a city that is usually so vibrant and so beautiful. Still beautiful, entering the parliament and then finding yourselves faced with hundreds of MPs, members of parliament, in a spirited, lively, very much, let's say, alive and hopeful parliamentary democracy. That was amazing for me to see. The sensation of addressing the plenary of the Ukrainian parliament and bringing that message of hope from here in Brussels and Strasbourg to the Verkhovna Rada, and then later a meeting with different political groups, different journalists, but also, of course, President Zelensky, where I wanted to be across the table from him and say, we are with you not only in times of peace, but also in times of war.
Indeed, it was really epic image, epic photo. As a result of the war, we have now extensive discussion in the European Union about common security policy. We have the strategic compass also in discussions also in the European Parliament. You have these two camps. Those who say that the NATO is the real framework because we have the Americans, their resources, and those who say that we should aim to something more independent, like a pillar in NATO, and maybe something between. How do you see, Madam President, to which direction this discussion is going?
Well, I would definitely think that the discussion around the strategic autonomy of Europe is different than it would have been 6 months ago. But what was already clear 6 months ago is that Europe cannot wait for other parts of the world to solve its problems or address its challenges, especially those happening in our neighborhood. We are now in a situation when we are talking not only about our climate goals, but that the Green Deal is now a security project and not just an environmental one. We're also talking about making sure that when you trigger the solidarity mechanism in the European Union, that member states, whether they are neutral or not, cannot be left alone. Nobody's talking about overlapping NATO capabilities and what the EU is doing, but if you see, for example, the excellent convergence of efforts of member states putting together military equipment that they could send with most efficiency and effectiveness to Ukraine, and that was done side by side with our NATO allies and our NATO partners. And then also now we see a discussion in member states that also perhaps 3 months ago would not have thought it to become so soon, that Finland and Sweden are considering and are on the path to joining NATO as a military alliance in order to combat this existential threat that we have in our union, shows that there is the political will to come closer on a proper defense union. The next few weeks we will have the conclusion of the conference on the future of Europe, and I think that without a doubt, and this is what this parliament will be looking at, is to finally have that real defense policy and a real defense union in Europe, and that is ultimately what strategic autonomy is about.
Indeed. Now, moving a little bit away from the war, a little bit, or let's speak about consequences. You could say that there's a new focus on the consequences of authoritarian regimes. For example, globally, for example, you see in China, there's a lot of investors who are escaping from there because they see what the authoritarian regime can do. On the other hand, we have the concept of the strong man, Putin, and its followers, and some say that in Europe we have these strong men and women. My question is, how does this relate to the European rule of law debate, or issue on which you have very much provided in your activity in the Libe Committee, and, for example, pointing out the grave cases or the violation of journalists, etc. So what is the impact of the rule of law debate?
The rule of law needs to be the cornerstone of everything we do, whether we are talking about rule of law in Europe, in countries aspiring to join the European Union, in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian parliament. Also, the word rule of law was talked about all the time, because ultimately the rule of law underpins everything. When my country joined the European Union, we looked at a set of rules-based world order, as we called it, and that is what countries and populations across the world are looking for. They want their rights to be protected. They don't want journalists to be assassinated. They want no politician to think himself or herself above the law. They also want stability, and they also want responsible decisions to be taken. For example, in an impending food crisis that we are going to have, also indirectly or directly because of the war in Ukraine, because prices are exploding through the roof. So on this, I think when we talk about rule of law, never should we look away from that remaining and underpinning everything we do, everything we say, and whatever we deal with, whether with countries that are inside the European Union or those who are outside.
Madam President, you mentioned the increase in the food prices, and that, way back when you were elected, that was our main concern, the economic. Now the war in Ukraine has taken the agenda, but the facts are still there. Prices are going up, inflation as a result. At a certain moment we will see the interest rate is coming up. In 2 years, 2 years and some months, we have European elections coming. And and many times on this, when economically it goes not so well, the European Union gets its share. So are you concerned?
Rather than concerned, I would say that this is a responsibility and a challenge that we need to face. The European Union has, let's say, done what during the pandemic would not have normally been done. That we've had more Europe than less Europe. And that was welcomed by our citizens because that meant that everybody had access to vaccines. That meant that medical equipment could travel between one member state and another because we needed it. That meant that we voted on an unprecedented recovery and resilience facility in order to improve and address our green and digital transition. So many things that show that more Europe, also we can say as resulted in the French election that we welcome and the results that we welcome, more Europe, and because our citizens want more Europe. Where do we go from now? We expect responsible decisions to be taken. With regards to food security, we need to make sure that no part of Europe is left behind. We need to make sure that those parts of the population that were already suffering in a post-pandemic scenario, that were already excluded from the market. We see women, for example, that have suffered disproportionately from the pandemic. Now we risk looking at a situation where once again the most vulnerable are even more affected by, in this case, also international geopolitical factors. Where does Europe stand? We need to be on the spot to address it. Now, we can address it with different means, transferring funds that were originally planned for something else to address this, understanding that is capping the solution, is a fundamental cut from dependence of Russia the solution, if making sure that the concept of energy union in terms of becoming sustainable and autonomous as a union becomes a real goal and not one that we say on paper every so often and then go back to looking inwards into our domestic realities. I think this is an opportunity that we have, and the next 2 years need to focus on that more Europe is the answer and not less. And my role as President of the European Parliament is to make sure that when a campaign is being run in all 27 member states, that is the message that is sent. And that our citizens, today we have seen it, they are the ones who have pushed their political leaders into taking decisions that we thought would never possible with regards to Ukraine, because our citizens look to Europe for answers beyond their national borders, and we need to grasp that opportunity.
You have made reference already a couple of times to Green Deal, Energy Union. Green Deal was and still is the Commission's big agenda, but that agenda was established when we didn't have pandemic and definitely before the war. How do you see that? And Parliament plays a huge role on the whole process. So how do you see that process going? To take into account that you see kind of two schools of thoughts emerging. Those who say, because of the war, we need to speed up this energy transition to renewable energy sources. And those who say, listen, the economic situation was different when we had this plan, prices are going up, energy prices going up, that needs to be priority rather than, and maybe we have to a little bit see the timetable of the whole Green Deal. How do you see that?
Well, this Parliament has been very ambitious. Why? Because this Parliament has a role to be ambitious. In 2019, when we got elected, we had an extremely, let's say, strong and clear message, particularly from the younger generations, that they wanted us to act because we were the last generation that could act to combat climate change. That has not changed. That still needs to remain our goal. Now, how do we address it? I said before, if we are talking about the Green Deal, it is about climate ambitions, it is about climate targets, but now also about security. This Parliament is working very, very intensively on the different strands of the Green Deal, the so-called Fit for 55 package. Work is going on very, very, let's say, well in all the different files. But we need to make sure we don't lose sight of the big picture. We need to make sure that our industry remains competitive. We need to make sure that our advantage when compared to other parts of the world is recaptured and not lost in big monumentous regulations that would lose us all that. For me, what I would also want to look for is a quicker investment into more renewables in our member states. We are still still very, very, very far away from our targets, especially when compared to other parts of the world. If this war has shown us anything, is that when we talk about strategic autonomy, we talk about our ability to regenerate and rethink what we depend on, how we depend on it, and where we address it. And I think this is an opportunity for us to look at those legislative negotiations and make sure that the solutions are found now and not postponed to a later, unfortunately, catastrophic stage, I would say.
You mentioned already a couple of times, you have mentioned that this whole crisis has created the momentum for the European Union, and indeed that also means that a new momentum for the European Parliament, institution which you are leading. So in your mandate, what in 2.5 years now, what do you want? How do you want to change the European Parliament?
I look at this institution as one that brings together so many brilliant minds. 60% of our members were first elected in 2019. Brilliant minds that are active, that are energetic, and that look to Europe as giving solutions rather than as causing problems. That look at democracy, rule of law, justice, protection of fundamental rights as the pinnacle of their activity. That look at the climate challenges that we have as finding solutions in this house. And this house of democracy, so to speak, needs to be perhaps seen more as such than it has been over the past years. We have suffered from visibility challenges because of the COVID pandemic. We are now back, extremely active, extremely, let's say, willing to play our part, not only as co-legislator, but also as the voice and the heart of democracy that Europe needs.
Thank you. For the very last question, I want to go back in the beginning, in your open, in your first speech as the President of the European Parliament. You made strong reference to youth. You mentioned Erasmus generation, and indeed you are, in this institution, the first president representing that generation. Now, being young, you could say, the world seems to be a very gloomy place. You have had the COVID, you have the war, inflation, everything seems to be so threatening. So what would be, Madam President, what would be your words of hope for the youth, for the young generation?
Well, I would say never give up. And I would say don't look at politics as a force of something that is not good. Being in politics and standing up for what you believe in is the best thing you can do. And if you believe in Europe, there is nothing better than being in the heart of democracy to push that through. What is the risk? That you don't vote, that you don't speak up, that you think that no one is going to represent your beliefs. There are people who represent your beliefs and will never stop fighting for your life to be a better one in the future.
That was a very good conclusion, Madam President. Thank you for participating for Martin Center Thinking Talks. And dear online viewers, thank you for following us. For future research, publication, papers, but more political ideas, you can follow in martencenter.eu as also the future Martin Center Thinking Talks. Thank you for following and looking forward for seeing you soon, online or in person.